really we see cultural heritage as being quite holistic. So including all dimensions of both tangible as well as immaterial culture. So everything from monuments, buildings, sites, landscapes, townscapes, artifacts, and crafts. These are all the physical manifestations of cultural expression from different societies around the world and through time. And so these physical expressions in and of itself would be meaningless if they were not tied to the kinds of folklore or spirituality or beliefs about society or individuals and the universe, etc., which animate them and give them meaning. And so UNESCO, as the international agency of the United Nations, which is mandated to work in the culture sphere, and is in fact the only United Nations agency which has this mandate, has been working for the last 60 years in order to develop international frameworks for cooperation and international standards for undertaking various aspects of safeguarding and protecting and promoting various forms of cultural expression. So you can see on the screen here is the summary of all of the international conventions that are today in place through UNESCO's work in order to address various aspects of the culture sphere. Starting in 1954 with the Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict. You can recall that the United Nations system was set up in the aftermath of World War II, the massive destruction to human lives as well as property that occurred then. One of the resolutions that was adopted quite soon after that was that should war happen again in the future, never again would we knowingly and allow for cultural property, buildings and towns and objects, etc., to be damaged. Later on came the 1970 Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. So meaning to say we do not steal objects. We do not allow for objects to be taken out of their own context, illegally sold, and then end up in private collections or in museums. And so this is a convention which is very close to the work of our museum colleagues here today. Not long after that came the Convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage, which Alex introduced this morning, which we know more familiarly as the World Heritage Convention. And so in a sense, it's become one of the conventions that has had the highest profiles, well known among governments and especially local administrators, like the Deputy Governor this morning, who wants Lamphun to become a World Heritage Site in the future. And the World Heritage Convention, which is focused on sites, physical places of both natural as well as cultural importance, has, by its very definition, a kind of priority placed on maintaining physical aspects of these sites. But that is not to say that the other aspects of the site, the people who live there, their values, etc., are not important. And in fact, we're learning over the 30-odd years of the convention that in fact, when you only focus on conserving the buildings themselves, it leads to very great troubles in the future because the very social fabric that gave rise to these buildings and towns and so forth can in some cases be neglected or in some cases even knowingly subverted in the interest of keeping the physical shell of the buildings in place. And so more and more, this is the mind shift that people who are archaeologists and architects have to make. And so it's why this course, which is kind of Anthropology 101, will be very useful, I think, for people like myself and others. And then in 2001, we began to look at other forms of heritage as well. So not just heritage on land, but also heritage underwater. And so in 2001, this gave birth to the Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage. And so as you can see, the 1954, the 1970, the 1972, and the 2001 Convention all are very much still based on this idea of protecting objects and places, and not very much on protecting the underlying values and practices of the people who produce and animate these objects and places. And so this gave rise in 2003 to a new convention, which is the convention of the subject of this discussion, which is the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. And the political background of this convention, which you can read in your reader, for instance, Richard Curran talks about it as well, is that if you look at for instance, the World Heritage Convention, and you look at the World Heritage List, which today contains about 911 sites all around the world, cultural sites and natural sites. When you look at where these sites are, there is a preponderance of these sites in places like Europe, in places like China or in India, places where there are civilizations of building and construction. But if you look at countries like various island nations in the Pacific, or some places in Africa, etc., the representation of places on the World Heritage List is very much less. And these countries, including countries in South America, were very vocal proponents of saying, why is the international community, through the framework of these international conventions, ignoring all these other forms of cultural expression, forms that are in fact in some ways as vital or even more vital to the ongoing identities, etc., of these nations and communities. And so with sustained pressure from these different countries, including countries like Korea and Japan, where the mechanisms for recognizing such forms of cultural expression are much more advanced, this gave rise to this convention. And then finally, we have in 2005 the Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, which is about new forms of cultural production and how to encourage that to happen. And so when taken all together and used in concert, you can see that it becomes a quite comprehensive framework and hopefully one that has a kind of a synergistic quality, that they work together. And when they work together, they actually create more benefits than when they're just used separately. And we can see that very clearly, for instance, the opportunities to use the World Heritage Convention with the Intangible Heritage Convention together can make places like Luang Prabang be much more sustainably managed than they are today, for instance. So the convention was adopted in 2005 officially, actually 2003, sorry, that's a typo. And it entered into force in 2006 after a minimum number of countries had ratified the convention. And then it became fully operational in 2008 with the adoption of what is called the operational directives. So the convention, if you read the text of the convention, doesn't go into a lot of detail about how to operationalize the convention, at least from a kind of bureaucratic administrative point of view. And so the operational directives were devised as a kind of guidelines in order to put the convention into place. Now, the objectives of the convention. First, it says that the very first objective is to safeguard the intangible heritage of humanity, which is a big task. And then we can define various aspects of this in the days to come. Second is to ensure respect for intangible heritage. Third is to raise the awareness of the importance of intangible cultural heritage and ensure mutual appreciation thereof. And it is true that, for instance, many governments still are very much skewed in terms of the way the bureaucracies are set up and the way that financial systems are set up to manage things like monuments much more than to manage things like intangible cultural heritage. And it is a kind of a new and emerging task.